Thank you so much, Chris. And so we'll turn it over to Rosemary.
Okay, thanks. Okay, struggles at home. But I should begin by saying that I was a student of Leo's in the mid-70s at Carleton in Ottawa. And also we were comrades together in OCLA, the Ottawa Committee for Labour Action, where in fact some of the themes of my talk I remember we both talked about in our seminar at Carleton, but also brought into OCLA. And you'll see in my talk those themes of reformism and reforms were very much a discussion point in the Ottawa Committee for Labour Action, and it's going to be the theme that I'm going to really address in this talk. I should also add that Leo supervised my master's thesis, and the insights that Leo had and we discussed at that time about the state, law and labour have remained very important for me in my work and of course in my teaching at Carleton. And so I have a debt that I owe to him in that respect in terms of that early formation in terms of the state and labour. Okay, well, I'm going to start with struggles at home. And as I've got written large here, it's so hard, there are so many, it's hard to know where to begin. And of course, as you can imagine, I was going to begin with labour, and Chris very wisely has covered a large aspect of the dismal state of the labour movement in Canada, particularly the private sector, and as you heard from Chris's figures, the disastrous fall in unionization rates in that private sector. Now, the public sector does remain strongly unionized. It has about a 72% rate, but they face constant struggles in terms of concession bargaining, and bargaining after bargaining, we see concessions really gutting somewhat many collective agreements. But as Chris pointed out, and I want to, in the spirit of this conference, try and overcome pessimism, and so I'm going to highlight some optimistic notes. And as Chris pointed out, the bright light has been the postal workers, undoubtedly. And not only in terms of what Chris pointed out, in terms of their agenda and their mobilization of both their members and communities in terms of taking back community power, but also at the bargaining table. A couple of negotiations ago, they completely ignored labour legislation. I was cheering them on. I thought this was right on. And they used the power of their current membership to bring about 6,000 rural mail deliverers, predominantly women, into the union. Now, agreed, there was a liberal government in power at the time. They probably couldn't have done it under the Conservative government, but nevertheless, they seized the day and they did it. And those members, they brought them in an unequal pay arrangement. They had the courage to do that, which many would have worried about that. But they brought them in with the proviso that they would negotiate equal pay for those workers. And now we have a current round of negotiations, and Jeff Bickerton, who was also a comrade in arms in OCLA, is at that bargaining table negotiating equal pay for work of equal value. And the postal workers are committed to that. They do not want to go to a long, drawn-out legislative equal pay complaint. And so that is a bright light. And what is sad really in the labour movement, that the postal workers still do not have the respect for their actions in the labour movement that they deserve. And they don't, especially amongst private sector unions. And I think that is something which we all have to work on. Now I'm going to move on from the labour movement and talk about other struggles because, of course, precarity rules the labour market. The young, the racialised and women workers are most likely to be found in precarious forms of work. And of course it's this precarity which now has contributed to the ongoing pay gap between men and women. And despite the struggles of women in the past to achieve equal pay, of course the precarity and the new rules of the labour movement has meant that youth and women and racialised workers are at that very end of the pay gap, if you like. So for every 87 cents an hour earned by women, men earn $1. So that hasn't changed a lot in the last few years, but of course if we take annual earnings, we're looking at a pay gap of 74%. So that ongoing struggle for equal pay, that struggle that we've been engaging in for what, 40 years, is still with us and in fact threatens to become worse as the labour market in a sense deteriorates for those people. The other struggle, of course, is against racialisation of peoples. Discrimination against indigenous and other racialised people, both in the workplace and in the communities, is very alive and well. And with the rise of Trumpian politics, even in Canada, as we know, overt fascism is on the rise. And the numbers, although they remain small, they do feel emboldened. And just recently, we've been seeing them on our streets demonstrating. There are so many other struggles, and I'm not going to go into detail. Struggles around environmental destruction, although the stopping of Energy East, I think, was a victory for Quebecers in many ways. Quebecers fought very strongly against that pipeline. Our struggle for reproductive rights continues. Those rights continue to be under attack. In Ottawa, we have demonstrators outside clinics on a daily basis, and because of struggles against that, we now have a new Ontario law coming into being to stop those demonstrators. But in terms of funding for reproductive rights, that's still an ongoing struggle. As we heard from Chris, the inequality is rising, and the perpetuation of poverty, especially amongst children of single mothers, it's long from being rolled back. And of course, we see the other struggles for students, the increases in tuition. And I have to say, again, Quebec, which is my adopted home, stood up a few years ago, the students in Quebec, in terms of rolling back tuition rights. But unfortunately, that struggle, which continues to be successful in Quebec, that spirit of struggle against it hasn't seemed to have been able to spark the same response in the rest of Canada. So neoliberalism and austerity politics has generated, in a sense, struggles against their existence. And what we're seeing is, it seems to me, if I look back to the 70s and our struggles then, it seems to me the number of small groups acting in terms of struggles and acting in terms of identity politics have grown really since over the last 30 years. There are many more groups of women struggling, different kinds of women, indigenous women, racialized women. There are poverty groups, of course. Here in Toronto, there's OCAP is a very, I think, commendable in its actions. Housing groups, disability groups, environmental activists. I think, in part, neoliberalism and austerity have generated even more a multitude of identities and a multitude of separate struggles. Some of those struggles are not on the left, some are on the right, but we have seen, I think, an increase in the number of groups engaging in progressive left struggles, and sometimes their struggles are contradictory in terms of their demands for reform. And we find that groups, like labour groups in your patch, conflicting with environmentalists, and we see this in a sense reflected in the two wings of the NDP in Alberta and in BC. So in terms of thinking about struggles, as socialists, we have to think about this whole set of identity political groups struggling against the devastating effects of neoliberalism and austerity over the last 30 years. I want to turn in that right now then to talk about Leo's work on reform and reformism, because I think it gives us insight and a way of thinking about what we as socialists have to do in terms of trying to come to grips with both the various politics of identity groups and how we might move forward and transcend pessimism. And now I'm going to have to rush. His work, of course, was on reform and reformism, was on social democracy in the early part of his work, both on the Labour Party and then in the 1980s, and more recently on the crisis in Greece. And of course, he was responding initially to the old debate about reform and revolution. And as I recall, he argued struggles for reform were important to building a revolutionary movement, but the capitalist state wouldn't simply disappear through the evolution of social democratic reforms. And indeed, we've seen this somewhat in the last decades of neoliberalism. We've seen how many reforms that were put in place in the 60s and 70s have now come under attack by capital, pensions being one example. And of course, his argument was that instead of reformism, what was needed was a focus on reforms that would serve to mobilize, educate, and build the capacity of the working class and popular forces to challenge the strength of capital. Now, I was going to talk about the NDP here, but I'll perhaps skate over the NDP and simply say it remains to be seen if the new federal leader will follow the examples of Corbyn and Saunders and call for reforms that indeed will challenge capital. I hear a little sniggering. Of course, there are always socialists in the NDP who are trying to change the direction of the party. So far, it seems that those forces within the NDP haven't been too successful in recent times. I want to then have us think about moving, if you like, beyond pessimism about the NDP maybe, and to focus on really the network of groups that are springing up right across Canada. And they're the solidarity groups, and I'm a member of Ottawa Solidarity, and I know some of you here are members of the Socialist Project. This is really a network of groups that have sprung up. And in a sense, those solidarity groups, what they're seeking to do is to unite the struggles of the wide range of working class identities and popular forces that I referred to earlier. There have been many attempts to build a non-sectarian movement left of the NDP for the last 30 years. They haven't been too successful, but the latest attempt is this group of solidarity and socialist groups across the country. And in August, there was a meeting in Montreal hosted by Quebec Solidaire, and this is being followed by virtual meetings every month by the 10 groups who make up that network. And I'm not going to, because Byron is on to me. I won't refer to exactly who the 10 groups are, but I will just finish what I want to say, and it won't be too long. The tension in these solidarity groups is to jump on every struggle from the various groups I referred to earlier and be out in the streets rather than developing and educating for a world beyond capital. But positively, what they're trying to do is connect with those very groups, and in responding to their calls of action are making, if you like, positive contacts with those various identity groups. I think the most encouraging aspect of this new network is Quebec Solidaire. And although I know there is some pessimism that as they move to become a parliamentary force, that their socialism will go by the way, nevertheless, I think it's one of the most optimistic groups that we have in the country today. The networking of Quebec Solidaire with us in Canada, the rest of Canada, I think is an important break in left Quebec politics. Quebec Solidaire has a well-developed socialist, eco-feminist vision, and its narrative about sovereignty is linked to that vision. They also have a strong anti-racist platform and present an important alternative to the PQ and the Liberals pandering to Islamic phobia. And they've shown themselves capable of mobilizing Quebecers when they supported the student movement against tuition increases 3 or so years ago. The problem for Quebec Solidaire is retaining its movement characteristics at the same time as it attempts to grow its parliamentary strength, and in that role withstand the pressures of capitalism. So, to end, Byron, I think we must, I want to come back to Leo, and Leo's recent statements around Greece, because I think they're very relevant to us here and relevant to Quebec Solidaire. Really, if we demand a politics that envisions creating a unity of working class forces, it doesn't mean effacing identities of women, racialized people, and other left popular forces, a point that Leo made in the 80s. Indeed, with these movements, I think we can help build a strengthened class unity movement. But the question for Quebec Solidaire right now, and as they turn more and more to being a parliamentary force, and it's a question that Leo would put in terms of the Greek crisis, is what kinds of reforms must we fight for? What kind of reforms with popular movements behind us, engaging in the same kinds of mobilization that can inspire similar developments elsewhere and can prove revolutionary enough to withstand the pressures of capital?